This is research reporting on quite a large project, as you will realize when I start talking about it. The obvious question is, why are we interested in street names? Now, many of you may have the context from recent debates about Black Lives Matter, the whole debate around Bristol and the statues, etc., etc. What we're interested in here is that the fact that the renaming of urban features, whether they are street names or other types of features, reflect changes in the political history of a place. And they also reflect shifts in what the Germans call the Weltanschauung, the worldview, and the political situation. And street names are particularly interesting because they have this kind of subversive element in them. The fact that we use them on a daily basis, we live in streets and we recite the names without always realizing what this name is associated with. So we agree with Zielinski, the ideological role of the city can be used as a measurement of political change, and this is what I'm going to show here. Now, this is interdisciplinary work, as I said. Between Germany and Poland, and it has three major elements: linguistic landscape research. So we have linguists involved in this, very honest sociolinguistics, as well as visualization and spatial analysis. And we're taking a temporal perspective over 101 years. You can see here Leipzig, where it's located in the eastern part of Germany. You can also see Poznan, which is the other case study that I'm not going to talk about. For those who are not very familiar with European history, and in particular the German history, the three periods I'm focusing on here are the Weimar Republic, the establishment of the democracy in Germany from 1918 onwards, up to 1933, when the Nazi government kicked in, which lasted until the end of the Second World War. And 44, the USSR-aligned country ruled by socialism was established up to 1989, when we then have the end of what we call the Cold War and the establishment of parliamentary democracy. And the question is, to what extent all these changes are reflected on the streetscape of the city? The data for Leipzig, we took the 2019 version of OpenStreetMap, and we kind of worked backwards over 100 years. Many of you may be disappointed to know that we actually used Excel spreadsheets to record the changes, which resulted in a massive spreadsheet of about 219,000 cells that we had to go through line by line and row by row to understand how these changes happened and record them. The data also came from the Leipzig Office for Statistics and Elections. We obtained a database which had information about the rationale for renaming, semantics around the street names, dates when the renamings happened, as well as other sources that we could find, for example, old maps, city plans, travel guides, archival documents, etc. And we recorded 2,230 street name changes over this period. This is just a very quick example of what happened in 1945 in a couple of street name changes. For example, we can see here that two streets were merged and renamed into a single street, the Friedrich-Ebert-Straße. We have, of course, an Adolf Hitler-Straße, which was renamed in 1945, and we interestingly have a street that was renamed twice in 1945. These are just examples to understand the complexity of the story. Number one is we can, of course, look at them diachronically, looking at change over time. And this is by year, the number of changes that happen. And we can identify the different periods that I mentioned earlier. It's a very basic analysis. So here are the 3 or 4 periods. I'm going to skip through them just to see what it looks like on the map. And on the map, we can see changes that are quite minimal. So streets that experienced 1, 2, or 3 changes. But once you go through and start focusing on streets that had more than 4 changes, you realize that these are the major arteries leading into and out of the city. So what we have here is the importance of the street associated with the number of changes that this street name experienced. Some of the smaller changes are the result, for example, of newly built up areas or annexations of different parts of the city. The second way we can look at it is in relation to new namings versus renaming. So existing streets being renamed or new streets coming in to this story. So what we see here is that they're split roughly 50-50. And there is clear temporal patterning in terms of the renamings being around the end of the Second World War, and the Wende, which is the kind of the merging of the eastern and western part of Germany, and then the unified Germany. And I'm not going to go through them in detail, but then we can do a more detailed analysis in terms of these changes. So it's not enough to know whether something was renamed or newly named, but we try to introduce this concept of ideology in the landscape. Can we identify whether a new ideology was created or removed, or whether the changes were kind of neutral? And I have an example here of Hindenburger Straße from Paul von Hindenburg, who was a military general and had some involvement in the Nazi era. He was also the second president of Germany. His street name was renamed into Friedrich Eberstraße, which was the first president of Germany. So what we have here is a change of ideology, clearly, as opposed to, for example, the removal of ideology by renaming Adolf Hitler Straße into Südstraße, or introducing another Südstraße or an extension to it, which is non-ideological. And when we look at things this way, then we have another interesting pattern here. The non-ideological and ideological changes are roughly split equally, but we have increased ideological activity during the Nazi era, was kind of expected. At the end of the Second World War, when all these Nazi names are being removed. And of course, we also have ideological activity during the GDR, the socialist regime. So we can see here on average a number of changes and how the Nazi Germany period kind of exceeds all the others in terms of bringing ideology or having ideological changes into the streetscape, while the parliamentary democracy—
3 minutes left.
Yeah. And the early democracy are basically introducing non-ideological changes. So what does all this look like on a map? Okay, so this is an early period, as I mentioned earlier, and we can see here the kind of patterning of certain areas. And for those who don't have a detailed knowledge of Leipzig, what is happening here is that this first democracy starts introducing Germanophone poets, historical elements from the Nibelungen saga, as well as some sort of political element here for areas lost during the First World War as a result of the Versailles Treaty. Then we have the Nazi Germany, and what we see here clearly is the introduction of SS, we have, of course, Adolf Hitler Straße, one of the major streets in Leipzig, as well as the introduction of SS generals, etc., in the cityscape. We have here the Battle of the Nations, the areas lost to the Treaty of Versailles, again, kind of being renamed, etc. Military admirals, SS officers, they're all there. Then what happens in the GDR regime is, again, a lot of ideological change. And what we have here, interestingly, is Russian artists, resistance fighters, German language poets in certain parts of the city, as well as, of course, the big names in socialist movements like Rosa Luxemburg-Straße and Karl-Liebknecht-Straße. And then more recently, this is the last part of the area of the eras we're looking at. I'm not going to expand on this, but you can see here that the whole ideological concept is subdued, where most streets are colored blue, i.e. non-ideological, or at least the changes. The conclusion So this research has focused on the urban city text from various perspectives, like linguistic aspect, critical toponymy, geovisualization, etc. There has been a focus on quantification and critical toponymy, looking at it longitudinally. And there's, of course, a lot of more research to be done, looking at the very detailed spatial patterning of these ideological and non-ideological changes with spatial analysis methods. Thank you.
We have a question from Chris in the chat. And he says, and I totally agree, really interesting topic, great talk. Have you looked at dynamically linking the time series plot with the map? It might be an interesting exploratory tool to zoom in on a specific event.
Yes, this is coming. I've been kind of experimenting with how to do this and create the animation. And it's almost there, actually. So at the moment, we're looking at these snapshots, but yes, it's coming in my forthcoming publication.
I have one about the semantics of toponyms, because I've done similar work on Italy. And in Italy, in Italian, it's quite easy to disambiguate and understand what street names refer to, because often it's a name, a full name and surname. And I don't know if in German you have a similar ability to be very certain about what a street name means. Or whether you have
this is such a good question. Yes, that's a brilliant question, because of course it varies country by country, and without very detailed local knowledge, plus a linguist, it always helps. It's very hard to know whether Black Street is referring to, the color black, very unlikely, or someone called Black. In Germany, we're quite lucky because they tend to use name surname. And if they only use, for example, Karl Lieblingstrasse or Rosa Luxemburg Strasse, so it's quite clear. If it's not very clear, then the name is quite easy to identify. So that was not a major problem, but I can see how it can be for other countries.
Yeah, for example, I think in Britain, it would be a lot harder to do.
Yeah.
So we have another question from Alex saying, brilliant work. Could the model be easily transferred to another place?
Even within Germany, it was not so easy to transport this concept that we applied. We had 3 case studies, a very small place, a medium place, and a larger place, and the variations are incredible in terms of the local politics. The comparison with Poland is also very interesting, because, of course, the periods that I mentioned here, the 4 periods, are not necessarily reflected in the Polish history. Some of these are and some are not. So it's very hard to roll out this kind of concept and model, let's say, across Europe, unless you are only focusing on the massive changes, like the Second World War, where things kind of change dramatically. But when it comes to what is ideological, what is not, what is locally sensitive, and what is internationally sensitive, I would say you cannot do this kind of work without detailed, at least national knowledge of what is happening.
Yeah, and Alan is adding that in Wales, we'd be naming lots of streets in Welsh first, so that there's also a multi-linguistic dimension in a lot of places in Europe. I was also wondering about how easy it is to define ideological versus non-ideological changes, because one might argue that it's a really great area where even choosing something that is not explicitly political is an ideological choice in itself, right?
Yes. This is brilliant, Andrea, because this has been my major debate with my colleagues, the linguists, etc. I mean, my first maps were basically only red, and they didn't like this at all. So we had to, have endless conversations about whether, what is actually an ideological change. And yes, you can take the view that everything is ideological, political, etc. But some things are more than others. Renaming Hitlerstrasse into something else, like Rosa Luxemburg Strasse, for example, is a much stronger political statement than renaming, I don't know, something very neutral like a flower into a poet. Again, there is an ideology behind it, but it's kind of less. It depends who the poet is, actually. But yeah, it's not an easy one, and it requires probably, almost certainly, it requires multidisciplinary teams to make these kind of decisions.